Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1891. The American frontier was closing. The wild, untamed West was gradually being conquered by railways, telegraphs, and the steady march of civilization. But in the remote corners of Kansas, where the prairie stretched endlessly under vast, unforgiving skies, some darkness remained untouched by progress. The state had been admitted to the Union just 30 years prior, and many parts still retained the raw, unpolished character of frontier territories. In Douglas County, about 18 miles southwest of Lawrence, stood the Blackwood Ranch. Once a prosperous cattle operation spanning nearly 1,200 acres, by 1891 it had fallen into a state of slow decay. The main house, a two-story structure of weathered wood and peeling paint, overlooked corrals, barns, and bunkhouses where a dozen men worked the remaining herd. The railroad had bypassed the property by 8 miles, and newer, more efficient operations were slowly driving the older ranches to ruin. The nearest neighboring ranch was 7 miles away, owned by the Carpenter family, who rarely interacted with the Blackwoods due to an old dispute over water rights. The landscape surrounding the ranch was quintessential Kansas prairie, rolling hills covered with blue stem grass that turned from vibrant green in spring to golden brown by late summer. Oak and cottonwood trees marked the course of a small creek that bisected the property. In spring, wildflowers dotted the meadows. In winter, snow transformed the landscape into a stark, white expanse, where the boundary between earth and sky became indistinguishable during blizzards. The Blackwood family had owned the ranch since 1867, established by Civil War veteran Colonel James Blackwood, who had arrived with his wife Eleanor and their infant son, William. The colonel had served with distinction in the Union Army during the conflict, and his military bearing never quite left him. Even in his 60s, he insisted on being addressed by his rank. By 1891, the colonel was 63, arthritic, and increasingly reclusive. His son William, then 25, managed most of the daily operations. Eleanor had passed in 1884 from what the Lawrence Weekly Tribune described as a wasting illness of unknown origin. The colonel had never fully recovered from his wife's death. William confided to the ranch foreman that his father would sometimes talk to Eleanor's empty chair at dinner or walk the hallways at night, stopping outside her former bedroom as if listening for sounds within. Local rumors suggested that the colonel had consulted spiritualists in Lawrence, seeking to communicate with his departed wife, though no record of such consultations exists in any known documents. It was in March of 1891 that the Blackwoods hired a new cook. The previous one, a Chinese immigrant known only as Mr. Lee in ranch records, had departed suddenly after 3 years of service. According to a statement later given by ranch hand Thomas Garrity to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, Mr. Lee had left without collecting his final wages, which was considered unusual. More curious still, he had abandoned his few personal possessions, including a small jade figurine that several hands recalled him treasuring as a memento from his homeland. Garrity's statement, preserved in the county archives, contains an observation that investigators initially overlooked. The Chinaman had been acting peculiar for about a week before he left. Jumpy-like, wouldn't eat with us no more, said he had dreams about the kitchen, though he wouldn't say what kind. The new cook arrived on March 18th. Her name was Abigail Marsh, a widow of 42 years who had answered an advertisement placed in newspapers as far away as Kansas City and Topeka. What made her application unusual was her willingness to live in such isolation, especially as a woman alone. The ranch was a full day's ride from Lawrence, the nearest town of any significance. For a single woman in 1891, such isolation meant vulnerability, far from the safety of neighbors and community oversight. Mrs. Marsh arrived by stagecoach to the town of Clinton, where William Blackwood met her with a wagon. The station master later recalled that she carried only one trunk and a small satchel. She wore plain, serviceable clothing, neither fashionable nor ragged. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore no jewelry except for a plain silver ring on her right hand. Not her wedding finger, the station master noted, which seemed odd for a widow woman. Ranch ledgers, preserved in the Kansas Historical Society archives, record her salary as $18 per month, plus room and board, considerably less than her predecessor, but standard for female domestic help of the era. What the ledgers don't explain is why the Blackwoods hired her without references or background information beyond what she herself provided. The colonel, once meticulous about such matters, apparently waved away his son's concerns, saying only that she'll do fine. According to the few surviving letters from that period, found in a metal box during renovations to the property in 1963, Mrs. Marsh claimed to have lost her husband in a mining accident in Colorado. She described herself as in need of quiet surroundings and experienced in cooking for large groups of working men. The letter of application, written in a neat, controlled hand, mentioned experience working for mining camps and cattle operations throughout Colorado and western Kansas, though it provided no specific names or dates. The ranch hands initially welcomed her arrival. Before Mrs. Marsh, they had been cooking for themselves for nearly 3 weeks, with predictably poor results. Thomas Garrity's statement describes her as plain-faced but neat, with hands that looked like they'd seen work. Another hand, Joseph Miller, noted that she was quiet, kept to herself, but could cook a fine meal. Miller, a man of 45 who had worked on ranches across the West, added that she had eyes that didn't match her face, too bright, too watching. He didn't elaborate on this observation. Frederick Williams, the youngest ranch hand at 17, described her differently in a letter to his mother in Topeka, found among his personal effects after his death. "The new cook makes me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. She smiles, but it never reaches her eyes. Last night I dreamed she was standing over my bed, just looking down at me, though I'm sure it was just a dream." What none of them knew, what would only be pieced together years later, was that no Abigail Marsh had lost a husband in any documented mining accident in Colorado between 1880 and 1890. No marriage records existed for an Abigail to anyone with the surname Marsh in the state during that period. The woman who called herself Abigail Marsh was, in essence, a ghost, a fabricated identity with no traceable past. Upon her arrival, Mrs. Marsh was given quarters in a small room adjacent to the kitchen in the main house. This arrangement was unusual. Previous cooks had lived in a small cabin behind the main house. The change was apparently made at the colonel's suggestion, ostensibly to allow her to begin breakfast preparations without having to trudge through snow or rain. William noted in his journal that the room had previously been used for storage and had required considerable clearing out to make it habitable. The woman who arrived at Blackwood Ranch that spring day was carrying more than her single trunk of belongings. She brought with her a knowledge of plants, powders, and preparations that would soon make itself evident in ways no one could have anticipated. Her first meal for the ranch was served the evening of her arrival. The ranch hands and the Blackwoods ate in separate dining rooms, as was customary. For the hands, she prepared a hearty beef stew, cornbread, and apple pie. For the Blackwoods, she served roast chicken with spring vegetables from the ranch's kitchen garden. This separation of meals, common in such settings, would prove significant in the months to come. By all accounts, the food was exceptionally good. Colonel Blackwood, who had become notorious for his foul temper since his wife's death, was reported to have actually complimented the meal. His son William was equally pleased. The hands devoured their portions and asked for seconds. Peter Schmidt, a German immigrant who had worked at the ranch for 5 years, declared it the best meal he'd had since arriving in America. No one thought much about the fact that Mrs. Marsh ate very little herself. She claimed to have a small appetite and preferred to eat after serving others. This habit would continue throughout her time at the ranch. On the rare occasions when she was observed eating, it was noted that she prepared a separate, simpler meal for herself, just bread and broth, according to Joseph Miller, even when we had beef and potatoes. Within 1 week of her arrival, the first unusual symptoms began to appear among the ranch hands. Joseph Miller complained of persistent headaches that were worst in the morning. Thomas Garrity developed what he described as stomach troubles that made it difficult for him to keep food down after breakfast. A young hand named Frederick Williams suffered from insomnia so severe he claimed not to have slept more than 2 hours a night for several days. These complaints were initially attributed to spring allergies, overwork, or, in Williams's case, homesickness, as he was only 17 and in his first job away from home. No one connected these symptoms to the food. Indeed, the meals were so satisfying that most men eagerly looked forward to mealtimes despite their increasing discomfort. Ranch hand Michael O'Donnell later told a barkeeper in Lawrence that the food tasted better than anything I'd ever had, even as it was making me sicker than I'd ever been. This statement, recorded in the barkeeper's journal, is one of the few first-hand accounts of the effects of Mrs. Marsh's cooking on the men who consumed it. In the main house, Colonel Blackwood reported feeling more vigorous than I have in years. His son noted in a letter to his aunt in St. Louis that his father's arthritic pain seemed to have subsided considerably. William himself mentioned feeling unusually alert and energetic, writing that the fog that has hung over this house since Mother's passing seems to be lifting at last. These divergent experiences would become a pattern over the following weeks. The ranch hands gradually developed chronic, debilitating symptoms, while the Blackwoods seemed to thrive. The key difference, though no one realized it then, was in what they were eating. The kitchen at Blackwood Ranch was Mrs. Marsh's exclusive domain. She insisted on handling all aspects of food preparation herself, declining offers of help even from the younger ranch hands who had previously assisted the former cook. She kept the kitchen door locked when not in use, claiming that rats had been getting into the provisions. She also requested that a new lock be installed on the door to her quarters, an unusual request for a servant, but one that William Blackwood granted without question. A discovery made during the 1963 renovations suggests there may have been another reason for this security. Behind a loose floorboard in what had been her quarters, workers found a small leather-bound book. Its water-damaged pages contained handwritten recipes, but not ordinary ones. Botanical experts from the University of Kansas later identified many of the plants described as containing varying levels of toxins. These included jimsonweed, nightshade, certain mushroom varieties, and several other species native to the Kansas prairies. More disturbing were the notations beside these recipes, indicating specific effects for sleep, for confusion, for pain that comes and goes, for slow weakening, and, most alarmingly, for death that looks natural. Each recipe listed precise measurements and preparation methods, suggesting a systematic approach to poisoning rather than haphazard experimentation. The book also contained a section on antidotes and counteragents, implying that Mrs. Marsh not only administered poisons but also knew how to protect herself and others from their effects. This would explain how the Blackwoods remained healthy while consuming food from the same kitchen. By mid-April, the health of the ranch hands had deteriorated noticeably. Ranch records show that 2 men had to be replaced due to illness. They left for Lawrence seeking medical attention and never returned. Their subsequent fate is unknown, as Lawrence medical records from this period were largely destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1897. However, cemetery records do show 2 unidentified men buried in paupers' graves in April 1891, both listed as dying from unknown stomach ailments. The remaining hands struggled to perform their duties. Symptoms now included muscle weakness, vision problems, persistent digestive issues, and in some cases, strange behaviors described by their colleagues as not being themselves. Work that once took a day now required 2 or 3. The cattle began to lose condition due to inadequate care, and fences fell into disrepair. One incident, documented in a letter from William Blackwood to a business associate, involved ranch hand Peter Schmidt, who was found one morning standing in the corral, staring at the sun and muttering incoherently. When approached, he reportedly didn't recognize his fellow workers and became violently agitated. He had to be restrained and was later taken to town. According to the letter, the local doctor diagnosed prairie madness, a common term of the era for various mental disturbances attributed to isolation and harsh frontier conditions. The letter, however, contains a detail that William seemed to find unremarkable, but which later investigators would consider significant. Schmidt kept repeating the same phrase, "She watches while we sleep." The doctor believes this to be a religious delusion of some kind. Throughout this period, Mrs. Marsh continued to prepare separate meals for the Blackwoods and the hands. She also began brewing special teas for the colonel, which she claimed would help with his arthritis. Whatever was in these concoctions, they appeared to have the desired effect. By May, Colonel Blackwood was riding his horse again for the first time in over a year. An entry in William's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death, notes his amazement at his father's recovery. "Father rode out to the north pasture today. I have not seen him sit so straight in the saddle since before Mother's passing. Mrs. Marsh's remedies have accomplished what 3 doctors from Lawrence could not. I begin to think her worth double her wages." Another entry, dated May 12th, hints at a growing attachment between the colonel and the cook. "Found Father and Mrs. M. in the parlor this evening, looking through the old family albums. He was showing her mother's photographs and telling stories I have not heard him recount since the funeral. There was something in the way he leaned toward her as he spoke. I cannot place my finger on it, but it left me uneasy." As spring turned to summer, the situation at the ranch grew increasingly strange. The hands now numbered only 8, down from the original 12. Those who remained were described by a cattle buyer who visited in June as hollow-eyed men who moved like they were twice their age. In his report to his employers in Kansas City, he noted that the ranch seemed half abandoned and advised against purchasing stock from them, citing concerns about proper care and feeding of the animals. In contrast, the Blackwoods prospered. Colonel Blackwood, despite his advanced years, was actively involved in ranch operations again. William had put on weight and was described by the same cattle buyer as ruddy-cheeked and vigorous. The ranch itself, however, was showing signs of neglect due to the reduced and weakened workforce. Perhaps the most telling document from this period is a letter from a neighbor, John Carpenter, to his brother in St. Louis. Carpenter writes of encountering William Blackwood on the road between their properties. "I hardly recognized young Blackwood. He has changed considerably since winter, heavier, with a flush to his face that suggests either robust health or fever. What struck me most was his manner. The boy has always been serious-minded and thoughtful, but now he speaks with an odd intensity, his words tumbling over one another as if he cannot get them out fast enough." He spoke at length about their new cook and her miraculous effect on his father's health. There was something unsettling in his enthusiasm, something almost feverish. I rode away from our meeting with the distinct impression that all is not well at Blackwood Ranch. Mrs. Marsh had by this time established certain rituals around meals. The hands were served promptly at dawn, noon, and dusk. The Blackwoods ate later, with more elaborate presentations. She had also taken over the kitchen garden, expanding it considerably, and adding many new plants that she claimed were herbs for flavor. When the ranch foreman asked about a particularly unusual plant with purple flowers, she reportedly told him it was not for eating, but for looking at. The plant was later identified, based on descriptions, as likely to have been monkshood or aconite, a highly toxic perennial. Later analysis of soil samples taken from this garden area in 1964 revealed unusually high concentrations of arsenic and other heavy metals. Whether these were naturally occurring or deliberately introduced remains a subject of debate among historians of the case. However, the concentrations were highest in the areas where herbs and root vegetables had been planted, suggesting intentional contamination of specific crops. By July, the ranch was in crisis. 3 more hands had left due to illness, and no replacements could be found. Rumors had begun to circulate in Lawrence about strange happenings at Blackwood Ranch. A barkeeper at the Golden Prairie Saloon reported that men would go silent when the ranch was mentioned, and one cowboy made the sign of the cross when asked if he would consider work there. The remaining 5 men were barely able to manage essential tasks. Cattle broke through unmended fences, predators took an unusually high number of calves, and the summer hay cutting fell behind schedule. It was around this time that Mrs. Marsh's behavior reportedly changed. Williams' journal describes her as becoming more familiar than is proper. She had taken to joining the Blackwoods for dinner, something unheard of for a servant in that era. More unusually, the colonel didn't object. William writes of finding them sitting together in the evenings, his father listening attentively as she spoke of her supposed travels and experiences. A particularly disturbing entry dated July 16th reads, "Found father in the parlor with Mrs. M. again tonight. They did not hear me enter. She was seated in mother's chair, the one no one has sat in since her passing, and father was on his knees before her, his head in her lap while she stroked his hair. I made some noise to announce my presence, and they separated, but not with embarrassment as one might expect. Rather, father looked at me with annoyance, as if I had interrupted something important. Mrs. M. simply smiled in that way she has, as if she knows something I do not." The most significant change, however, was in Mrs. Marsh's attitude toward William, his journal records increasing unease with her attention. "Mrs. M. brushed against me in the hallway today. It seemed deliberate. When I stepped back, she looked at me with an expression I cannot describe, except to say it reminded me of how a hawk looks at a rabbit. I find myself avoiding being alone with her, though I cannot fully explain my reluctance, even to myself." On July 23rd, a significant event occurred that would later be seen as a turning point. Thomas Garrity, who had been with the branch longest among the hands, collapsed while mending a fence in the east pasture. According to his later statement, he had been working alone when he was overcome by dizziness and fell. When he regained consciousness, it was nearing dusk, and he realized he was too weak to make it back to the ranch house. Instead of heading west toward Blackwood Ranch, Garrity dragged himself east. His statement claims he had seen something the previous evening that convinced him his life was in danger if he returned. He managed to make his way to the neighboring Carpenter Ranch 7 miles away, where he was found nearly delirious from heat and exhaustion. The neighbor, John Carpenter, took him in and sent for a doctor from Lawrence. By the time the doctor arrived 3 days later, Garrity had recovered enough to tell his story. What he revealed was disturbing enough that Carpenter immediately sent for the sheriff. According to the official report filed on July 28, 1891, Garrity claimed that he had accidentally observed Mrs. Marsh preparing the separate meals. Through the kitchen window, he saw her adding substances from small bottles to the food intended for the ranch hands, while leaving the Blackwoods portions untreated. He also claimed to have witnessed her collect plants from her garden at dawn, separating them into different baskets with great care to keep them from touching. More alarmingly, he claimed to have witnessed her engaged in what he described as unnatural intimacy with both Blackwoods, father and son, on different occasions. Given the social norms of the time, the report does not detail what specifically was observed, but notes that it was of a nature to shock decent sensibilities. Garrity believed that the Blackwoods were under some form of influence or control, as their behavior was not in keeping with their known characters. Perhaps most disturbing was Garrity's claim that he had seen Mrs. Marsh at night, walking among the bunkhouses, looking in windows. On one occasion he woke to find her standing over the bed of Frederick Williams, the youngest hand, who was in a deep sleep despite her presence. She was holding something over his face, Garrity stated. A cloth or small bag of some kind. When she saw me watching, she smiled and put a finger to her lips, then left without a word. Sheriff James Wilson, a veteran lawman who had served Douglas County since 1882, was initially skeptical of these claims. However, the specificity of Garrity's statement, combined with the known illness among the ranch hands and the strange rumors circulating about Blackwood Ranch, convinced him to investigate. He assembled a group of 6 men, including 2 deputies and a doctor, to ride out to the ranch the following day. What they found there would become one of the most disturbing cases in Kansas history, though it remained largely undocumented in official records for decades. The full report, filed by Sheriff Wilson on August 2, 1891, was misplaced in county archives until 1958, when it was discovered during a routine cataloging project. Even then, its contents were deemed so disturbing that it was restricted from public access until 1972. Upon arrival at the ranch on the morning of July 29th, the sheriff's party found an eerie silence. No hands were visible working the property. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cook stove normally being lit for breakfast. The corral held only 3 horses, where there should have been at least a dozen. Cattle wandered freely near the buildings, no longer confined to their proper pastures. The sheriff approached cautiously, directing his men to spread out and search the outbuildings, while he and 1 deputy headed for the main house. The bunkhouse was their first stop. It was empty, beds left unmade as if the men had risen but never returned to them. Personal belongings remained in place: tobacco pouches, playing cards, letters from home. A pot of coffee sat on the small stove, cold and covered with a film of mold, suggesting it had been abandoned days ago. In the barn, they found the body of ranch hand Frederick Williams, the young man who had complained of insomnia. According to the sheriff's report, he appeared to have hanged himself from a roof beam. The condition of the body suggested he had been dead for approximately 2 days. A note was pinned to his shirt, though the sheriff noted that the handwriting did not match samples of Williams' writing found among his possessions. The note read simply, "I cannot sleep even now." The doctor who accompanied the sheriff noted several unusual aspects about the apparent suicide. The young man's hands were bruised in a pattern suggesting he had been restrained at some point before his death. More puzzling still, there were traces of an unknown substance around his mouth and nostrils, which the doctor collected for later analysis. These samples were sent to a chemist in Kansas City, but were lost in transit, and no determination of their nature was ever made. The main house presented an even more disturbing scene. The front door stood open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Inside, the parlor was immaculate, every item in its place except for a single chair, described as a woman's sewing chair with embroidered cushions, which had been moved to the center of the room and faced the window that overlooked the approach to the house, as if someone had been watching for visitors. The sheriff's men found Colonel Blackwood in his study, seated in his favorite leather chair before a cold fireplace. At first glance, he appeared to be sleeping, but closer inspection revealed he was dead, though with no obvious cause. His face, according to the report, bore an expression of utmost contentment. One hand rested on an open book in his lap, a collection of poetry by Tennyson, open to In Memoriam, the poet's extended meditation on grief and loss. The other hand held a small silver locket containing a braided lock of blonde hair, which family records confirmed belonged to his late wife, Eleanor. The doctor's examination noted no signs of violence or struggle. The colonel appeared to have died peacefully, perhaps from heart failure or a similar natural cause. However, the doctor was troubled by the lack of rigor mortis, despite the body being cold, suggesting death had occurred at least 24 hours earlier. He also noted a faint, unusual odor on the colonel's breath, which he could not identify but which reminded him of bitter almonds, a potential indicator of cyanide poisoning, though he was careful not to make this claim definitively in his report. William Blackwood was discovered in his bedroom upstairs. Unlike his father, his death had been violent. He had been stabbed multiple times with what the sheriff determined was likely a kitchen knife. The wounds were described as frenzied in nature, suggesting an attack of extreme emotional intensity. Most were concentrated around the face and neck, with defensive wounds on his hands and forearms indicating he had tried to protect himself. The room showed signs of a desperate struggle. Furniture was overturned, a window broken, and blood spattered across the walls and bedding. A particular detail noted by the sheriff was that a framed photograph of Eleanor Blackwood, which normally stood on William's dresser, according to the housekeeper who was later interviewed, had been smashed, the glass ground into the floorboards as if by a deliberate heel. Of Mrs. Marsh, there was no sign. The kitchen was immaculate, all implements cleaned and put away. Her quarters had been emptied of personal belongings. The only unusual item found was a small wooden box in Colonel Blackwood's study, containing what appeared to be love letters, addressed to "My dearest James," and signed with the initial E. The dates on these letters were recent, the most recent just 3 days before the sheriff's arrival, though Eleanor Blackwood had been dead for 7 years. Handwriting analysis, later conducted by a Lawrence schoolteacher, determined these letters were not written by Eleanor Blackwood, though they had apparently been made to appear as if they were. The implication was clear. Mrs. Marsh had been posing as the spirit or reincarnation of the colonel's dead wife, feeding into his grief and longing for connection with his lost spouse. The remaining ranch hands were never found. Whether they had fled, been killed, or succumbed to the mysterious substances in their food remains unknown. Local folklore suggests that graves were later discovered in the north pasture, but no official excavation was ever conducted. A report filed by a subsequent owner of the property in 1902 mentions uncovering human remains while digging a new well, but these were never formally examined by authorities. A manhunt for Abigail Marsh extended across Kansas and into neighboring states, but she was never apprehended. Descriptions were circulated, but they varied so widely as to be almost useless. Some described her as tall, others as short. Some recalled dark hair, others light. The only consistent detail was that she was plain-faced but neat. One wanted poster, preserved in the Kansas Historical Society archives, lists her age as approximately 40-50, and her distinguishing characteristics as none observable. This inconsistency in physical description led some investigators to later speculate that Abigail Marsh may have been skilled in disguise, or possibly that different people had been describing different women. The true identity of the person who served as cook at Blackwood Ranch in the spring and summer of 1891 remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Kansas history. The ranch itself was sold at auction that December, fetching less than half its estimated value due to its grim reputation. The new owners, a family named Thornton from Missouri, reportedly experienced no unusual occurrences, though they did replace all the cookware and destroy the kitchen garden. Mrs. Thornton, in a letter to her sister, mentioned that no matter how thoroughly I clean, I cannot rid the kitchen of a certain bitter smell that seems embedded in the very walls. The family stayed only 3 years before selling the property and returning east. The property changed hands several times over the decades that followed before being parceled and sold off during the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. The main house stood abandoned for years before finally collapsing during a storm in 1947. Local children claimed it was haunted, though their tales featured standard ghost story elements with little connection to the actual events that had occurred there. In 1947, a woman named Sarah Jenkins was arrested in Omaha, Nebraska, for poisoning her employer's family. When her background was investigated, authorities discovered she had worked as a cook in at least 7 households across the Midwest over the previous 2 decades. In each case, family members had died of apparently natural causes. The pattern was similar. She would be hired by a wealthy family, typically one with an elderly or infirm patriarch. Within months, younger family members would begin experiencing health problems, while the patriarch improved and often developed a close relationship with Jenkins. While being questioned, Jenkins allegedly asked if they had ever heard of the Blackwood affair. Before she could be further interrogated, however, she managed to consume a poison she had concealed on her person and died within minutes. The autopsy revealed that she had swallowed a capsule containing a mixture of cyanide and another unidentified compound that accelerated its effects. Whether Sarah Jenkins was Abigail Marsh or perhaps someone inspired by her has never been determined. Photographs of Jenkins show a plain-faced woman in her 70s, which would align with the approximate age Marsh would have been in 1947. The most disturbing epilogue to this story came in 1963 when the remaining original structures of Blackwood Ranch were being demolished to make way for modern agricultural buildings. Workers discovered a hidden space beneath the kitchen floor, accessible only by removing a specific floorboard that had been cut to appear seamless when in place. Inside this cache, approximately 2 feet square and 1 foot deep, was a collection of personal items: watches, wedding rings, small purses, pocket knives, the kind of valuables working men might carry. Each was carefully wrapped in cloth and labeled with a name and date. The names matched those of the ranch hands who had worked at Blackwood Ranch during the spring and summer of 1891. The dates appeared to mark when they had left the ranch, or more likely, when they had died. Some items bore traces of a dark substance that testing later suggested was dried blood. Also found in this cache was a daguerreotype photograph showing a woman in her 40s, plain-faced but with striking eyes that seemed to hold the viewer's gaze even across the decades. She wore a high-necked dark dress typical of the period, with a cameo brooch at her throat. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing a high forehead and prominent cheekbones. Nothing in the image would have attracted particular notice, except for those eyes, described by the worker who found it as the kind that follow you around the room. On the back was written a single line: "They all consumed what I served, never questioning why I ate elsewhere." The photograph and the collection of items were sent to the Kansas Historical Society in Topeka for preservation and study. However, during transit, the wagon carrying these materials was caught in a flash flood on the Kansas River. The driver survived, but the artifacts were lost, swept away by the floodwaters. All that remains is the driver's description and a hastily made list of the items by the site foreman before they were packed for transport. In 1968, a historian researching this case for a book discovered county records suggesting that Eleanor Blackwood had a younger sister who was committed to the Kansas Territorial Insane Asylum in 1859 for poisoning her parents. The records indicate she escaped in 1866 and was never recaptured. The sister's name is listed only as E. Blackwood, leading to speculation that the E who signed the love letters may have been Eleanor's sister rather than someone posing as Eleanor herself. This would explain how Abigail Marsh knew so much about the family and was able to manipulate the colonel so effectively. It would also suggest a motive: revenge against the brother-in-law who had committed her, and the nephew she may have seen as her sister's replacement. Hospital records describe E. Blackwood as possessed of a quiet demeanor that masks violent tendencies and knowledgeable in herbs, and simple as to a degree unusual in a woman of her station. She was committed after her mother died of a mysterious wasting illness, and her father became inexplicably confused and volatile before his own death several months later. A further connection emerged in 1969 when a researcher at the University of Kansas discovered a student thesis from 1921 that examined the history of the Kansas Territorial Insane Asylum. The thesis included interviews with former staff, including an orderly who had worked there in the 1860s. He recalled the escape of a female patient who had been held in isolation due to her dangerous knowledge and proclivities. According to his account, she had cultivated plants in a small garden she was allowed as therapy, using them to brew teas that she claimed helped with her nerves. After her escape, several staff members who had consumed these teas fell ill with symptoms similar to those later experienced by the Blackwood Ranch hands. The case of the Blackwood Ranch cook remains officially unsolved. No conclusive evidence links any known person to the crimes committed there. The ranch land itself is now part of a corporate farming operation, the original structures long gone, the exact locations of the house and outbuildings lost to time. Occasionally, farm workers report finding small objects in the soil, buttons, coins, a rusted fork, echoes of the lives that ended there. Yet, in the rural areas southwest of Lawrence, the story persists. Local residents still speak of strange illnesses that sometimes affect entire households, of plain-faced women who appear seeking work as cooks or housekeepers, only to disappear when questions arise about their backgrounds. Children are warned not to accept food from strangers, a caution more specific than the general advice given in other communities. Perhaps most unsettling is the recurring report of meals where the preparer insists on serving others, but never eats the food herself. In Douglas County, such behavior is still met with suspicion, a cultural memory of a time when death was served daily at the dinner table, and those who consumed it never suspected until it was too late. To this day, some Kansas families maintain the tradition of everyone at the table waiting until all are served before the first bite is taken, and watching carefully to ensure that the person who prepared the meal also partakes of it. When asked about this custom, older residents might smile tightly and say, "We remember the Blackwood cook," though fewer and fewer understand the reference with each passing generation. As for Abigail Marsh, or whatever her real name may have been, no confirmed sighting was ever reported after she vanished from Blackwood Ranch. But in the decades that followed, from Nebraska to Oklahoma, Missouri to Colorado, there were scattered reports of unexplained family illnesses, of servants who disappeared, of plain-faced women who knew too much about herbs and remedies. Some historians have attempted to trace a pattern through these incidents, seeking connections that might reveal the continued activities of the Blackwood cook. A promising lead emerged in 1905, when a household in Omaha lost 3 family members to what was described as gastric fever shortly after hiring a new housekeeper. The woman, who called herself Margaret Wilson, disappeared the day the local doctor suggested the deaths might not be due to natural causes. A photograph of Wilson, found in a local newspaper article about the family's charitable activities, shows a woman whose features could match the description of Abigail Marsh, though the image is too grainy for positive identification. In 1912, a boarding house in Wichita became notorious when 5 male boarders died within a 6-month period. The proprietress, described in police reports as a widow of unremarkable appearance but meticulous habits, sold the establishment and left town just as authorities began to investigate. No trace of her was found, though a local pharmacist later reported that she had regularly purchased compounds that, while legitimate for household use, could be combined to create various poisons. Perhaps the most compelling connection came in 1919, when a cook working for a prominent family in Kansas City was dismissed after the youngest son claimed he had seen her adding something to the father's tea. The boy's mother had died the previous year of what doctors had diagnosed as early-onset dementia, characterized by confusion, paranoia, and eventually complete physical debilitation. When the family's oldest daughter investigated the dismissed cook's background, she found that references and previous employment details were fabricated. By then, the woman had vanished. The last potentially connected case occurred in 1924 in a small town near Wichita, where an elderly female boarding house keeper was suspected of slowly poisoning her male tenants. When authorities arrived to question her, they found she had vacated her room just hours before, leaving behind only a handwritten recipe book that was confiscated and subsequently lost in an evidence room fire in 1932. One of the investigating officers later claimed that inside the book's cover was an inscription, "From the Kitchen of A.M., Blackwood Ranch, 1891. However, with the book's destruction, this claim cannot be verified. The officer, speaking to a local newspaper in 1956, said, I'll never forget those recipes. They weren't just for food. There were sections on calming drafts and sleep aids and things labeled for troublesome men. I've been a lawman for 40 years, and that book gave me chills like nothing else I've ever seen. If these incidents were indeed the work of the same woman, she would have been in her 70s by the time of the 1924 case. The trail goes cold after this point, suggesting she may have finally died, taking her secrets with her. Alternatively, as some researchers have proposed, she may have trained an apprentice or apprentices who continued her practices. The similarity in methods across such a span of time and distance suggests either a single, long-lived perpetrator or a succession of individuals working from the same playbook of botanical poisons and psychological manipulation. A theory proposed in a 1965 monograph by Dr. Margaret Holloway of the University of Kansas Department of Criminology suggests that Abigail Marsh may have been part of a tradition of women who used their knowledge of herbs and human psychology as weapons in a world where they had little formal power. Dr. Holloway notes that many of the plants found in Mrs. Marsh's garden have been used for centuries by women seeking to control or eliminate abusive husbands or unwanted pregnancies. What makes the Blackwood case exceptional, she writes, is not the methods employed, but the scale and systematic nature of the poisonings. This theory gained support when, in 1967, a journal was discovered in the effects of a woman who had died in a nursing home in Columbia, Missouri. The journal, written in a cipher that took months to decode, contained detailed information about plant-based poisons, their effects, and methods of administration. More disturbing were the entries that appeared to document the woman's activities across several states between 1895 and 1931, including locations that matched known poisoning cases. The journal's author referred to herself only as E, and made several references to the Kansas business and James's Folly, possibly alluding to Colonel James Blackwood. And so, the story of the ranch cook, who served death in every dish, remains one of the darkest chapters in Kansas history. A reminder that on the American frontier, danger came in many forms, and sometimes the most lethal threats were not the obvious ones of weather, wildlife, or hostile encounters, but rather the slow poison administered by trusted hands in the comfort of home, one meal at a time. The Blackwood case touches on fears both ancient and modern. The vulnerability that comes with allowing others to prepare our food, the trust we place in those who enter our homes, and the potential for revenge to simmer silently for years before boiling over into violence. It reminds us that history's most effective predators are not always those who attack openly, but those who smile as they serve the poison, who watch patiently as it takes effect, who maintain the facade of caring even as they calculate the dosage needed to bring about death. In rural Kansas, particularly in Douglas County, certain traditions persist that can be traced directly to the Blackwood case. Families are cautious about hiring household help without thorough background checks and references. Home gardens are approached with a mixture of respect and wariness, with children taught from an early age which plants are safe and which are not. Most telling is the still common practice of having everyone at the table take their first bite simultaneously, an unconscious cultural memory of a time when one woman's refusal to eat what she served proved to be the only warning sign of her deadly intentions. Local folklore has, of course, embellished the story over the decades. Some versions claim that Mrs. Marsh could control animals, particularly snakes, which she sent into the bunkhouse at night to watch the sleeping men. Others suggest she could change her appearance at will, explaining the inconsistent descriptions provided by witnesses. A particularly persistent tale holds that she did not flee the ranch at all, but is buried somewhere on the property, her spirit still lingering in the kitchen gardens that grow wild where the house once stood. Historians and criminologists continue to study the case, drawn by its unique combination of methodical poisoning, psychological manipulation, and the perpetrator's complete escape from justice. Modern analysis of the few surviving documents suggests that Abigail Marsh may have had formal education unusual for a woman of that era, possibly including medical or pharmaceutical training. Her understanding of dosages, progressive symptoms, and the psychological effects of various compounds indicates knowledge beyond folk remedies or traditional women's herbal lore. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case is how thoroughly Abigail Marsh understood the social invisibility of her position. As a plain, middle-aged female domestic servant in 1891, she occupied a space that was simultaneously essential and overlooked. She used this invisibility as camouflage, knowing that a cook was expected to work alone, to maintain control over her domain, and to serve others without being truly seen herself. In the hierarchical world of a 19th century ranch, no one questioned when the ranch hands grew ill while the owners thrived. Such disparities in health and fortune were simply the expected order of things. In the words attributed to the mysterious cook herself, "They all consumed what I served, never questioning why I ate elsewhere." This simple statement encapsulates the terrible power that comes with the trust we place in those who feed us, and the blind spots that social hierarchies create even in matters of life and death. The next time you sit down to a meal prepared by someone you barely know, perhaps that thought will give you pause. And perhaps you'll watch carefully to make sure they eat exactly what they've served to you. Even now, in the fields where Blackwood Ranch once stood, wheat and corn grow in abundance, feeding families across America. The soil is rich and fertile, perhaps unnaturally so. Local farmers joke that nothing grows quite as well as the crops planted over the old kitchen garden site, though they are careful to label produce from that section separately and never consume it themselves. And sometimes, on cool autumn evenings when the wind blows just right, residents living near the old ranch property report a strange, bitter scent in the air, like almonds, but sharper, more insistent. "That's just her," old-timers say with knowing nods, still cooking after all these years. In the archives of the Kansas Historical Society, a single page from the recipe book found beneath the kitchen floor has been preserved. Most of the writing has faded to illegibility, but the title remains clear: "For Those Who Trust Too Easily." Below it, in a different ink that has remained dark and vibrant despite the passage of time, is a simple addendum: "Every meal is an act of faith." The Blackwood Ranch case reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those we invite into our homes, those whose threat is masked by social convention and everyday necessity. It stands as a dark chapter in Kansas history, a reminder that not all monsters announce themselves with fang and claw, that some come bearing gifts of food and comfort, with death hidden beneath the surface of seeming kindness. For the residents of Douglas County and beyond, the legacy of the ranch cook who served death in every dish continues to echo through generations, a cautionary tale whispered over kitchen tables and taught through family traditions. It speaks to the vulnerability inherent in community, in trust, in the simple human act of breaking bread together. And it asks a question that has no easy answer. How well do we really know those who feed us?